so first let's remind ourselves what utilitarianism as a moral theory is. It's all grounded in this one core principle that the right thing to do is always the thing that creates the best possible outcome, not just for you, but for the entire world. So basically, the utilitarian says, we want to do the thing that makes the most people happy and makes the least people sad. Out of all the possible things we can do, we basically want to take the positive minus the negative of the effects out there in the world, and we want to do the thing that creates the greatest net balance of positive minus negative. Now, that can be worded in this principle of utility, which says the right action is that action which, when compared to one's alternative possible actions, would maximize utility. And we define utility as the universal net balance of happiness over suffering. So we want to do the most possible good we can. We want to create the most well-being and eliminate the most suffering as we possibly can in the world. If we can do that, we're always doing the right thing. That's just the definition of what it means to do the right thing for the utilitarian theorist. So this theory can run into some potential issues if we think about situations in which the thing that maximizes well-being in the world might not necessarily line up with what we really think is right. Different people might have different intuitions about this particular case. So I'm going to read a case out for you and ask you to think about whether you think the individual in this thought experiment did right. Now, one thing I should flag about this thought experiment is that thought experiments are designed specifically to test our intuitions about very specific things. So we can think about what we would do in the real world in a scenario like this. But for the thought experiment, we're going to hold a lot of things fixed. So it's just a thought experiment. It's not the real world. So we can kind of imagine that everything is just so. I'll explain that a little clearer once I actually read the thought experiment. Okay, so here we go. Consider the following scenario. After years of research, a medical scientist named Dr. X realizes that she is just one step away from developing a cure for all known forms of heart disease. Such a breakthrough would save hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions. The world could finally be rid of heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, and the like, a feat as monumental as the eradication of deadly smallpox. That one last step in her research, however, is technologically feasible, but potentially morally problematic. It involves the killing of a single healthy human being to examine that person's heart tissue under a microscope just seconds after the heart stops beating. The crucial piece of information needed to perfect the cure can be acquired only as just described. She cannot distract this piece of tissue from a cadaver. She cannot take it from an accident victim. She cannot take it from someone suffering from a disease or a person who has been dead more than 60 seconds. We're also meant to assume that Dr. X couldn't find somebody to simply volunteer to give their tissue for this medical breakthrough. So suppose that she really couldn't find somebody to consent to this procedure. So she only really has two options. Either she kills a single healthy human being against their will, or she doesn't cure heart disease. And we're also supposed to imagine that she knows 100% that if she procures this last piece of data, she will cure heart disease, thus saving millions of people. Dr. X decides that the benefits to humanity from the cure are just too great to ignore. She locates a suitable candidate for the operation, a homeless man with no living relatives and no friends, someone who would not be missed. Through some elaborate subterfuge, she manages to secretly do what needs to be done, killing the man and successfully performing the operation. She formulates the cure and saves countless lives. No one ever discovers how she obtained the last bit of information she needed to devise the cure, and she feels not the slightest guilt for her actions. So, in your opinion, did Dr. X do the morally right thing? We know she broke the law, but was her breaking the law justified for the utility value that she was able to promote in the world? She saved millions of lives by sacrificing one life. That one life, she specifically chose somebody who wouldn't create, with the only negative utility created by her action was the loss of that life and any pain that he or she might have experienced when she took his life. Well, I'll ask you to pause and think about whether what Dr. X did in this scenario was right or wrong, in your opinion. Now, some people might think that she did the right thing, because she saved millions of lives and only sacrificed one life, whereas others may think that she didn't. So let me know, what do you think? Now we can relate a problem like this to what's called the trolley problem. You might have heard of this before because it's become kind of a meme in popular media. But the trolley problem is a similar example in some senses because it involves the weighing of one versus many when it comes to taking a life. Now, in this example, you're supposed to imagine that you witness a train that was burrowing down these tracks, and if the train continues on the path that it's on, it will run over these 5 people, killing them. Now, you're meant to imagine that you're on the sidelines and you see a lever, and the lever is able to switch the train to another track such that it kills one person instead of 5 people. So I'll ask you a question. Do you pull the lever? Do you think it's morally permissible to pull the lever? And why? Why or why not? Many people, whether or not they themselves would feel comfortable pulling this lever, do think it's morally permissible to pull the lever here because you're saving these 5 people's lives in favor of this one person. Now, again, it's a thought experiment. So we're supposed to imagine a kind of idealized scenario. We aren't imagining any specific details about who these people are. So maybe the situation changes if this person is a friend of yours or a relative. Maybe you would feel differently about pulling the lever in these cases. But in the original version of the thought experiment, all 6 of these people appear basically identical. They're all basically identical strangers. You don't know anything about them. All you know is that if you pull the lever, one person dies. If you leave the lever alone, 5 people die. So typically the majority of people say that either they would pull the lever or they think that pulling the lever is morally an okay thing to do. Do you agree? Okay. Well, if you agree that pulling the lever is a morally okay thing to do, you may not agree with this next case, even though this next case also involves killing one person in order to save 5 people. It's interesting to think about the contrast between these two cases. In the next case, instead of having 2 tracks and pulling a lever, there's one track and there's still a trolley that's burrowing down the track set to hit 5 people. You're on the footbridge above the trolley and you notice that it's set to hit these 5 people. In the thought experiment, you are too small to stop the trolley if you were to jump in front of it yourself. But you notice a large man next to you who you know for sure if he was on these tracks in front of these 5 people, he would stop the trolley, killing him but saving these 5 people. So, do you push the man, killing one to save 5? If you said no to this case and you said yes to this case, it's interesting to think about why these two cases are different. We feel differently about pushing somebody than we do about pulling a lever. There also might be something different about the fact that this man is just casually enjoying his day above a trolley on a footbridge, whereas this man is tied to tracks. So even though both cases involve killing one to save 5, we can see that we feel very differently about each of these cases. And it's not clear whether that different feeling is a result of a fundamental moral difference between the cases or if it's just some sort of emotional bias on our part. However, we can think of other clear cases in which it so the majority of people typically agree that in the original version of the trolley problem case, it is permissible to pull the lever. It's usually a lot more split about whether people think it's permissible to push the man. Typically, a slight majority of people think it is not permissible to push the man in the second case. Now, there's a third kind of case in which the overwhelming majority of people think it's definitely not morally permissible to kill one to save 5. And when we get into cases like this is where we get to what is called the problem of justice. The problem of justice is an objection to utilitarianism. It's basically saying that if utilitarianism is true, sometimes we're going to be forced to do things, not forced, but morality is going to demand that we do things like push the man in the trolley problem example, or even worse, the kidney transplant doctor example, which I'll talk about in a second. Let me skip this slide and come back to it. So imagine you're a doctor and you have 5 patients upstairs who need an organ donation. You have one healthy patient come in with a runny nose. You test a healthy patient, you find out that they're a blood match for all 5 of your patients upstairs that need an organ donation. Just like in the trolley problem thought experiment, imagine that all 6 of the people here are like relatively identical. So again, the doctor could, let's imagine that he has reason to believe that he's not going to get caught. Imagine that he kills his healthy patient, harvests their organs, and transplants those organs into his 5 patients upstairs. Well, I think that the majority, if not all of us, should definitely agree that it would be morally wrong for the doctor to harvest his healthy patient's organs, because that is just so clearly a violation of the rights of that healthy patient, right? So if we agree that it would definitely be wrong for this doctor to harvest the kidneys and the organs of the patient that came in just for a runny nose, then we can frame that as potentially a problem for the utilitarian. Because if we spell out the details of the case just right, it could be that the utilitarian would tell the doctor to harvest his healthy patient's organs. Now, again, that's clearly not right. So we have a problem for utilitarianism. We can frame this problem in terms of a moral argument. Premise 1 being that if utilitarianism is the correct moral theory, then the morally right thing to do is always to maximize utility. That's just a definition of what utilitarianism is, right? The second premise is that sometimes we might be able to maximize utility by violating human rights, such as in the kidney transplant example. It violates the human rights of the healthy patient to take their organs against their will, right? So if it maximizes utility to violate human rights, then utilitarianism might tell us to do so, because human rights for the utilitarian aren't as important as utility values. But this can't be right. It is never morally right to violate human rights. Therefore, utilitarianism can't be the correct moral theory. It can't be the end of the story. It can't be the case that utility values are the only thing that matters morally. But if utilitarianism is true, they are the only thing that matters morally. So, what do you think? Is the problem of justice a real problem for the utilitarian? How do you think the utilitarian theorist might respond to this objection? Do you think that they would agree with premise 2 that violating human rights would maximize utility? Do you think they would agree with premise 3 that violating human rights is never morally right? What do you think? And finally, do you think you're a utilitarian, or do you think the problem of justice is just too big of a problem to ignore?